I never thought I'd be standing beside my son's casket watching my husband of 43 years introduce his 28-year-old mistress to the mourners as family, but there I was, 71 years old and witnessing the most devastating betrayal of my life at the worst possible moment. The funeral home smelled of lilies and grief, that particular combination of floral arrangements and sorrow that seems to cling to the walls of places where people say their final goodbyes. My son Stewart lay in the mahogany casket we'd chosen together just 3 days ago, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been during his final months battling cancer. At 45, he'd been too young, too vital, too full of plans for his daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Susie's upcoming wedding and dreams of the grandchildren he'd never meet. I stood in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 20 years ago, my hands clasped tightly around the tissue that had long since become useless. The viewing was supposed to be a time for quiet reflection, for friends and family to pay their respects to my boy. Instead, it had become a circus, and the ringmaster was my husband Randall. "I'd like you all to meet Annabelle," Randall announced. To the small group gathered near the casket, his arm wrapped possessively around a blonde woman young enough to be his granddaughter. She wore a navy blue dress that hugged her curves and heels that clicked against the funeral home's hardwood floors with each step. "She's been such a support to me during this difficult time. She's family now. Family now." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I watched as my sister Janice's mouth fell open, as Stewart's best friend Franklin took a step back in shock, as even the funeral director's professional composure cracked slightly. This woman, this stranger, was being introduced as family. At my son's funeral while I, his mother, stood forgotten in the corner like an afterthought. "Randall," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the soft classical music playing in the background. "This isn't the time or place for, Greta, please," he interrupted, not even looking at me as he continued to guide Annabelle around the room. "Annabelle has been helping me process my grief. She understands me in ways that..." He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear to everyone present. Annabelle, to her credit, looked uncomfortable for a moment, glancing between Randall and me with uncertainty. But then Randall squeezed her hand, and she straightened her shoulders, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes to the other mourners. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said to the room in general, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Stewart was such a wonderful man. Randall has told me so much about him." The irony wasn't lost on me. This woman who had never met my son, who had been sharing my husband's bed while Stewart fought for his life, was offering condolences to his friends and family as if she belonged there. As if she had any right to speak his name. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Franklin, his face flushed with anger. "Greta, I'm so sorry," he whispered. I don't know what to say." I patted his hand gently, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know I still possessed. "It's all right, Franklin. Really. But it wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right." Across the room, Randall was now showing Annabelle the photo display. We'd set up pictures of Stewart from childhood through his final birthday last month. "This is from his college graduation," I heard him say, pointing to a photo where Stewart wore his cap and gown, his arm around me as we both smiled widely. "And this one is from when he got his promotion at the engineering firm." Each word felt like another nail being driven into my heart. These were our memories, mine and Stewart's, and Randall was sharing them with his mistress as if they were tourist attractions. As if our 43 years of marriage, of building a life and raising our son together, meant nothing. But what Randall didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he paraded his young girlfriend around our son's funeral, was that I had been busy during these past months of Stewart's illness. While he'd been out working late and traveling for business, I'd been doing more than just caring for our dying son and managing my grief. I'd been making phone calls. Lots of them. I'd been meeting with lawyers, accountants, and investigators. I'd been asking questions, demanding answers, and gathering evidence. And what I'd discovered about my husband's finances, his business dealings, and his not-so-secret affair was going to change everything. You see, Randall thought he was clever. He thought his 71-year-old wife was too old, too trusting, too broken by grief to notice what he was doing. He thought I spent my days knitting and watching game shows, completely oblivious to his betrayal. He was wrong on all counts. As I watched him fawn over Annabelle, introducing her to our insurance agent, our neighbor Morty, and even our pastor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a cold, clear certainty. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This wasn't just about him finding someone younger and prettier to massage his aging ego. This was about respect. This was about dignity. This was about 43 years of marriage and a son's memory being desecrated by a man who thought his wife was too weak to fight back. The funeral director approached me discreetly. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry about the situation. If you'd like, I can ask them to." "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "Let him finish his show. Let everyone see exactly who he really is. Because tomorrow, when we gathered for Stewart's memorial service at the church where Randall and I had been married, where we'd baptized our son, where we'd celebrated decades of anniversaries and holidays, Randall was going to learn that his grieving widow wasn't nearly as helpless as he'd assumed. Tomorrow, he was going to discover what happens when you underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose except her dignity, and who has spent the last 6 months ensuring she won't lose that too. As Annabelle laughed at something Randall whispered in her ear. Standing just feet from our son's casket, I touched the envelope in my purse and smiled for the first time in weeks. The real funeral was about to begin. The morning after the viewing, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee from the mug Stewart had given me for Mother's Day 15 years ago, the one with "World's Best Mom" printed in faded blue letters. Through the window, I could see Randall in the backyard on his phone, pacing back and forth near the rose bushes I'd planted when we first moved to this house in 1987. Even from this distance, I could see the animated way he gestured with his free hand, the smile that hadn't graced his face during any conversation with me in the past 2 years. I knew who he was talking to. The same person he'd been talking to every morning for the past 8 months, usually while I was supposedly still sleeping upstairs. Annabelle Brooks, 28 years old, a dental hygienist from the clinic where Randall had been getting his teeth cleaned since his regular dentist retired. The same clinic where he'd started scheduling appointments every 6 weeks instead of his usual twice-yearly visits. The phone calls had started innocently enough, or so Randall probably told himself. A follow-up about his gum sensitivity, perhaps, or questions about the new whitening procedure. But I'd noticed the change in his behavior immediately. The way he'd started checking his appearance in the hallway mirror before leaving the house. The sudden interest in cologne and breath mints. The gym membership he'd purchased for his health, despite never showing interest in exercise during our entire marriage. For 43 years, I had been Mrs. Randall Patterson, the dutiful wife, who managed the household, hosted the dinner parties, smiled at the appropriate times during his business functions. I had raised our son while Randall built his insurance agency, supported his ambitions while quietly setting aside my own dreams of returning to college, of maybe writing the historical fiction novels I'd always imagined myself creating. In the early years, we'd been happy. Or at least, I'd thought we were. Randall had been attentive then, bringing me flowers on random Tuesdays, surprising me with weekend trips to the mountains. We'd shared dreams about growing old together, about traveling to Europe when we retired, about spoiling our future grandchildren, but somewhere along the way, those dreams had become mine alone. Randall had grown comfortable with our routine, comfortable with taking my presence for granted. I became part of the furniture, as reliable and unnoticed as the grandfather clock in our foyer that chimed every hour without anyone really listening anymore. When Stewart's cancer diagnosis came 18 months ago, I'd expected it to bring us together the way tragedies sometimes do for couples. Instead, it had driven us further apart. While I spent my days researching treatments, driving to chemotherapy appointments, and holding our son's hand through the worst moments, Randall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Had retreated into his work, his golf games, and eventually, into the arms of a woman young enough to be his daughter. The cruel irony was that Randall had always prided himself on being a devoted family man. At business gatherings, he'd regale anyone who would listen with stories about his successful son the engineer, his loving wife who kept their home running smoothly, his perfect life in the suburbs. He'd been planning to run for president of the Rotary Club next year, a position that required a certain image of stability and respectability. That image mattered to him more than I'd ever realized. Which made yesterday's performance at the funeral home all the more shocking. In introducing Annabelle as family, he wasn't just betraying our marriage, he was publicly dismantling the very reputation he'd spent decades building. I heard the back door open and close, followed by Randall's footsteps crossing the kitchen. Behind me. He poured himself coffee without saying good morning, a habit that had developed over the past few months. The silence between us had become so natural that I barely noticed it anymore. "The service is at 11, I said quietly, not turning around to look at him. "Pastor Williams wants to meet with us at 10:30 to go over the eulogy." "Actually," Randall said, his voice carrying that careful tone he used when he was about to deliver unwelcome news, "I think it would be better if I handled the eulogy alone. You're still so emotional about everything, and I don't want you to break down in front of everyone." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. In 43 years of marriage, Randall had never once suggested that I was too emotional to handle something important. I had been the one to speak at his mother's funeral. I had been the one to address Stewart's teachers when he struggled in middle school. I had been the one to handle every crisis, every difficult conversation, every moment that required grace under pressure. I see, I said, still not turning around. And I suppose Annabelle will be attending the service as well? The pause that followed was answer enough. I heard him shift his weight from one foot to the other, the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. Greta. I know yesterday was difficult, but Annabelle has been a real source of strength for me. She understands grief in a way that, well, she lost her father young, so she knows what it's like. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I had lost both of my parents, had nursed my mother through Alzheimer's while Randall complained about the inconvenience to our social schedule. But apparently, my understanding of grief wasn't sufficient anymore. I think, I said carefully, that our son's funeral should be about our son, not about your sources of strength. Don't be like this, Greta. His voice held a warning now, the tone he used when he wanted to end a conversation without actually resolving anything. This is hard enough without you making it more difficult. Making it difficult. As if my presence at my own son's funeral was an inconvenience to be managed. I finally turned to face him, taking in the man I'd married 4 decades ago. He was still handsome at 72, his silver hair carefully styled, his blue eyes sharp behind his reading glasses. He kept himself in good shape with his new gym routine, and his clothes were always perfectly pressed thanks to the dry cleaner he'd started using instead of trusting me with his shirts. But looking at him now, I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. This wasn't the man who had held my hand during my difficult pregnancy with Stewart. This wasn't the man who had cried when we received Stewart's acceptance letter to engineering school. This was a stranger wearing my husband's face, a stranger who thought so little of me that he could parade his mistress at our son's funeral and expect me to be grateful for her presence. You're right, I said finally, my voice steady and calm. This is difficult. More difficult than you know. Something in my tone must have caught his attention because he looked at me sharply, as if seeing me for the first time in months. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and his attention shifted immediately back to the screen, his face softening into that smile I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. As he typed his response, probably to Annabelle, I made a decision that had been building in my heart for weeks but hadn't quite crystallized until this moment. I was done being invisible. Done being taken for granted. Done being treated like an inconvenience in my own life. But unlike yesterday's shocking display at the funeral home, my response wouldn't be emotional or dramatic. It would be methodical, calculated, and absolutely devastating, because while Randall had been busy planning his new life with his young girlfriend, I had been busy planning something else entirely. And today, at our son's memorial service, the second act of this tragedy was about to begin. The transformation had begun 6 months ago, though I hadn't recognized it as such at the time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when I'd received the call from my financial advisor, Margaret Hutchins, asking if I was aware that significant funds had been withdrawn from our joint savings account. I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Patterson, Margaret had said, her voice carrying that careful professional tone that suggested she was walking on eggshells. But there have been several large withdrawals over the past few months, and the bank requires spousal notification for amounts over $25,000. $25,000. I'd sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I now faced another morning of Randall's casual cruelty, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. I wasn't aware of any large withdrawals, I'd said carefully. Could you send me the statements? That evening, when the statements arrived by secure email, I discovered that over the past 8 months, nearly $75,000 had been withdrawn from our joint account. The transactions were scattered across different dates, different amounts, but they painted a clear picture: jewelry stores, expensive restaurants, a weekend trip to a resort in Asheville, car payments for a vehicle I'd never seen. I hadn't confronted Randall immediately. Something told me to be careful, to gather more information before making any accusations. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was the survival instinct that kicks in when you realize your entire life might be built on quicksand. The next morning, while Randall was at work, I'd driven to our bank and requested copies of all our account activity for the past year. The woman behind the desk, a sweet girl named Linda who'd known me since Stewart was in high school, had looked concerned as she printed page after page of transactions. Mrs. Patterson, she'd said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, I probably shouldn't say this, but if you're having concerns about your accounts, you might want to consider opening a separate checking account. Just for your own peace of mind. I'd thanked her and driven home with a manila folder full of evidence that my husband was living a double life. But instead of crying or screaming or throwing dishes against the wall, I'd done something that surprised even me. I'd gotten methodical. That afternoon, I'd called my old friend Dorothy Chen, who'd worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. Over coffee at her kitchen table, I'd explained my situation with the careful neutrality of someone reporting the weather. Greta, Dorothy had said, setting down her cup with a sharp clink, you need to protect yourself. Today. Right now. She'd given me the name of a divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Reeves who specialized in cases involving financial deception. She'd also given me the number of a private investigator, though she'd warned me that hiring one was a serious step. Think carefully about what you want to know, Dorothy had advised. Because once you know it, you can't unknow it. I'd thought about it for exactly 24 hours. Then I'd called both numbers. Meeting Patricia Reeves had been like talking to a doctor about a diagnosis you'd been dreading but somehow already knew was coming. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with burgundy carpets and mahogany furniture that spoke of discretion and competence. The first thing we need to do, Patricia had said after reviewing my financial documents, is secure your assets. If your husband is spending marital funds on an affair, we need to document everything and protect what's left. She'd helped me open accounts at a different bank, accounts that Randall would have no knowledge of or access to. We'd transferred half of our joint savings, money I was legally entitled to as his spouse, into my individual accounts. We'd also set up automatic transfers from my Social Security checks and the small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother's estate years ago, but the real revelation had come from the private investigator's report. Marcus Webb was a former police detective who looked like someone's kindly uncle but had the instincts of a bloodhound. His findings had been both shocking and oddly liberating. Annabelle Brooks wasn't just Randall's girlfriend. She was his business partner. For the past year, while I'd been focused on Stewart's illness and our crumbling marriage, Randall had been systematically moving money from our personal accounts into a new business venture, a dental consulting firm that supposedly helped small practices improve their efficiency and profitability. Annabelle was listed as the company's chief operating officer, despite having no business experience beyond working as a dental hygienist. The company was registered under both their names. The office space was leased jointly. The business bank account showed regular deposits from our joint savings, disguised as consulting fees and equipment purchases, on our monthly statements, but here's what Marcus had discovered that Randall didn't know I knew: the business was hemorrhaging money. The consulting contracts they'd secured were minimal, barely covering their office rent. Most of their supposed clients existed only on paper. The expensive equipment purchases were actually luxury items for their shared office space: a massage chair, a wine refrigerator, a sound system that cost more than most people's cars. Randall hadn't just been cheating on me. He'd been embezzling from our marriage to fund a fantasy business with his girlfriend, a business that was failing spectacularly while draining our retirement savings. The most infuriating part was how simple it had been for him to do it. He'd counted on my trust, my focus on Stewart's care, my apparent disinterest in our finances. For 43 years, I'd been content to let him handle the money while I managed everything else. He'd assumed that pattern would continue indefinitely. He'd been wrong. The week after Stewart's diagnosis became terminal, while Randall was supposedly attending a business conference in Charlotte, Marcus had photographed him and Annabelle at a couple's spa retreat, charged to our joint credit card as medical equipment consultation. The photos showed them laughing over champagne, holding hands during a sunset walk, completely absorbed in each other while I sat beside our dying son's hospital bed. That's when I'd stopped feeling hurt and started feeling calculating. I'd spent the next 3 months quietly documenting everything. Every suspicious charge, every unexplained absence, every business expense that didn't make sense. Patricia had helped me understand that in North Carolina, adultery could affect alimony and property division, especially when marital assets had been used to fund the affair. But more importantly, I discovered something else. The house we'd lived in for 36 years, the house where I'd raised Stewart and hosted countless family gatherings, was in my name alone. Randall had transferred it to me 15 years ago for tax purposes, on the advice of his accountant. At the time, it had seemed like a romantic gesture, a way of ensuring I'd always have security. Now it was my ace in the hole. The business that was supposed to be Randall's ticket to a comfortable retirement with his young girlfriend was actually a financial disaster that had consumed most of our liquid assets. But the house, worth nearly $400,000 in today's market, belonged entirely to me. I'd also learned that Stewart, in his final weeks, had updated his will. As his only child and heir, I would inherit his life insurance policy, his retirement account, and his small investment portfolio. It wasn't a fortune, but combined with my protected assets, it would be enough to secure my independence. The irony was almost poetic. While Randall had been planning his new life with Annabelle, funded by our marital assets, he'd actually been financing his own downfall. Every dollar he'd spent on their failing business was a dollar that wouldn't be available for his support after our divorce and Stewart's memorial service. Scheduled for this morning at the church where our entire community would gather, was going to be the perfect venue for Randall to learn exactly how much his betrayal was going to cost him. As I sat in my kitchen, listening to him end his phone call with Annabelle, I touched the folder of documents I'd prepared for today's revelation. Inside were copies of every bank statement, every business filing, every photograph Marcus had taken. Also included was a formal separation agreement that Patricia had prepared, along with papers that would freeze all joint accounts pending divorce proceedings, but the piece de resistance was the letter I'd written to the president of the Rotary Club, detailing Randall's use of community connections to promote his fraudulent business and his affair with a woman half his age. The letter was already addressed and stamped, ready to be mailed after today's service. Randall thought today was about saying goodbye to our son. And it was. But it was also about saying goodbye to the woman I'd been for 43 years. The woman who'd enabled his selfishness, ignored his character flaws, and sacrificed her own dreams for his comfort. Today, that woman was going to die right alongside the marriage that had killed her. What Randall didn't know about my morning routine was that for the past 4 months, I'd been waking up at 5:30 each day, a full 2 hours before him. While he slept peacefully upstairs, dreaming whatever dreams unfaithful husbands dream. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, methodically building the case that would destroy his comfortable assumptions about our future. The laptop itself was a secret. I'd purchased it with cash from my individual account, telling the young man at Best Buy that it was a surprise for my granddaughter's college graduation. The lie had come so easily that it surprised me. Apparently deception was a skill I'd developed alongside my investigative abilities. Every morning, I documented new evidence. Screenshots of social media posts that Randall thought I was too technologically inept to find. Bank statements showing charges to restaurants where he'd never taken me. Credit card receipts for jewelry purchases that had never appeared in my jewelry box, but the real treasure trove had been Annabelle's Instagram account. The girl had no sense of discretion whatsoever. Her posts from the past 8 months told the story of their affair in vivid detail. Though she'd been careful never to tag Randall directly or mention him by name, there was the photo of champagne flutes at Romano's, the expensive Italian restaurant downtown, posted on the same night Randall had claimed to be at a client dinner. The caption read, "Celebrating new beginnings with my special someone." A week later, she'd posted a picture of her hand wearing a diamond tennis bracelet I'd never seen before. When he surprises you just because it's Tuesday. #blessed #spoiled. The Asheville resort photos had been particularly damning. Annabelle had documented their entire weekend getaway with the enthusiasm of a travel blogger. Couples massage at the spa. Dinner at the resort's 5-star restaurant. A sunrise breakfast on their private balcony. The total cost, according to my bank statements, had been nearly $8,000, but it was the business registration documents that had provided the most shocking revelations. Marcus Webb had been thorough in his investigation, obtaining public records that painted a clear picture of Randall and Annabelle's professional partnership. Their dental consulting firm, optimistically named Premium Practice Solutions, had been incorporated 6 months ago with grand ambitions. According to their business plan, filed with the state and therefore public record, they intended to revolutionize small dental practices through innovative efficiency protocols and patient experience enhancement strategies. The language was pretentious corporate nonsense, but the financial projections were breathtaking in their naivety. They'd estimated first-year revenues of $500,000, with steady growth to $2 million by year 3. They'd planned to hire a staff of 12 employees and lease office space in the most expensive business district in town. The reality was starkly different. In 6 months of operation, Premium Practice Solutions had secured exactly 3 consulting contracts, totaling less than $15,000 in revenue. Their office space sat empty most days, since neither Randall nor Annabelle had any actual clients to meet with. Their promised staff of 12 consisted of a part-time receptionist who, according to Marcus's surveillance, spent most of her time playing games on her phone. The most galling discovery was how they'd marketed themselves to potential clients. Randall had leveraged every relationship he'd built over 4 decades in the insurance business, presenting himself as a successful entrepreneur with decades of business experience. He'd hosted networking events at the country club, attended Chamber of Commerce meetings, and even spoken at a Rotary Club luncheon about innovative business partnerships. What he hadn't mentioned to anyone was that his business expertise was entirely theoretical. His insurance agency had been successful, yes, but it had been a traditional, conservative operation that relied on established relationships and tried-and-true methods. The consulting business required skills he simply didn't possess: marketing, innovation, operational efficiency analysis, and strategic planning for industries he knew nothing about. Annabelle's qualifications were even more questionable. Her resume, which Marcus had obtained through contacts at the dental clinic where she'd worked, showed no business education, no management experience, and no expertise beyond basic dental hygiene procedures. Yet she'd positioned herself as the company's operational expert, commanding a salary that exceeded what most experienced business consultants earned. The office space itself was a testament to their misplaced priorities. Instead of investing in actual business development, they'd spent tens of thousands of dollars creating what Marcus described as a luxury clubhouse. The furniture was high-end, leather and mahogany. The conference room featured a crystal chandelier and original artwork. The break room included a wine refrigerator, a massage chair, and a sound system that could have served a small concert venue. It was, I realized, the office equivalent of a love nest. A place where Randall could play successful businessman while Annabelle played his sophisticated business partner, funded entirely by money that should have been securing our retirement. But perhaps the most infuriating discovery was the contract they'd signed with a public relations firm. For $12,000, charged to our joint credit card as business marketing expenses, they'd hired professionals to create their company website, design their logo, and write press releases announcing their launch. The website was still active, featuring professional headshots of both Randall and Annabelle alongside testimonials from satisfied clients who, according to Marcus's investigation, didn't actually exist. The About Us section described Randall as a visionary leader with 4 decades of business excellence and Annabelle as an innovative strategist with deep industry expertise. Reading those fabricated credentials, I'd felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This wasn't just a midlife crisis or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was systematic fraud, perpetrated against me and potentially against their clients. The final piece of evidence had arrived just last week, 2 days before Stewart's death. Marcus had obtained their most recent business bank statements, showing that Premium Practice Solutions was not just failing, it was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. Their monthly expenses exceeded their income by a factor of 5. At their current burn rate, they would exhaust their remaining capital within 60 days, which meant that Randall's dream of riding off into the sunset with his young girlfriend was actually a fantasy funded by our marriage's death throes. Every dollar he'd stolen from our joint accounts had brought him closer to financial ruin, not freedom. The irony was poetic. While I'd been secretly securing my own financial independence, Randall had been just as secretly ensuring his dependence on the marriage he was betraying. Without access to our joint assets, without the security of our shared home, without the social capital he'd built as half of a respected couple, his new life with Annabelle would collapse as quickly as their business was collapsing. Today, at Stewart's memorial service, I was going to make sure that collapse happened exactly as spectacularly as their affair deserved. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, during what should have been one of our final peaceful moments with Stewart. He was in hospice care by then, drifting in and out of consciousness, but still lucid enough to recognize us and speak in whispers. I was holding his hand, reading him passages from the adventure novels he'd loved as a boy, when Randall's phone rang. He didn't even hesitate. In the middle of my reading Treasure Island, with our son possibly hearing his favorite story for the last time, Randall answered his phone right there in the hospice room. "Hey beautiful," he said in a voice I barely recognized, warm, intimate, completely inappropriate for the setting. No, it's fine. I can talk." Stewart's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his father with confusion. Even in his weakened state, he could sense something was wrong. I squeezed his hand gently and kept reading, trying to maintain the peaceful atmosphere we'd worked so hard to create, but Randall continued his conversation, walking only a few steps away to the window. "The contract looks good," he was saying. "Yes, we should celebrate tonight. Dinner at Romano's? Perfect." I watched my son's face as he processed what he was hearing. His father, planning a celebration dinner while his son lay dying. The hurt in Stewart's eyes was almost unbearable, but what came next was worse: acceptance. As if he'd already known his father was capable of this level of selfishness. "Dad," Stewart whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Randall held up one finger to his dying son, and continued his conversation. "No, tomorrow morning is perfect for the presentation. We'll knock them dead." The phrase, "knock them dead," spoken over a hospice bed was so grotesquely inappropriate that I felt something snap inside me. But it was Stewart's response that sealed my resolve. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered to me, his voice barely audible. "I know you'll handle everything after. You always do." Those words haunted me for weeks. My son, in his final days, wasn't worried about leaving me alone with Randall. He trusted me to handle everything. It was both a blessing and a burden, his faith in my strength at a moment when I felt completely broken. The pressure had intensified during Stewart's final week. Randall had started staying away from the hospice for entire afternoons, claiming he needed to handle business matters that couldn't wait. I later learned from Marcus's surveillance reports that these business matters involved apartment hunting with Annabelle, that they'd looked at condominiums in the trendy part of downtown, places with granite countertops and city views that cost more per month than most people's mortgages. Annabelle had posted Instagram stories from these apartment tours, captioning them, "House hunting with my love. Can't wait for our new adventure." The timing was unconscionable. While I sat beside our son's bed, monitoring his breathing and trying to make his final days as comfortable as possible, Randall was planning his post-marriage life with the enthusiasm of a newlywed, but the moment that crystallized my determination came the night before Stewart died. I'd been at the hospice for 18 hours straight, and the nurses had finally convinced me to go home for a shower and a few hours of sleep. When I returned the next morning, I found Randall asleep in the visitor's chair, his phone still in his hand. The screen was unlocked, showing a text conversation with Annabelle from the night before. I didn't mean to read it, but the words were right there. "Impossible to ignore, Annabelle. How much longer do you think? I know this sounds terrible, but I miss you. Randall, not much longer now. Doctor says maybe a day or two. Then we can start our real life together. Annabelle, I can't wait. This has been so hard, pretending we're just business partners. I love you so much. Randall, I love you too. Just a little longer and we'll never have to hide again." I stood there in the pre-dawn quiet of the hospice room, reading my husband's eager anticipation of our son's death as the gateway to his freedom, and felt something inside me turn to ice. This wasn't grief making him seek comfort elsewhere. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress. This was a man who saw his son's death as an inconvenient delay in his romantic timeline. Stewart died 6 hours later, with me holding one hand and Randall holding the other. But even in that moment of profound loss, I noticed that Randall kept checking his phone. Later, I would learn that Annabelle had been texting him updates about an apartment viewing she was attending on his behalf. The funeral arrangements became another source of tension. Randall had insisted on the most expensive casket, the largest flower arrangements, the most elaborate service, not out of love for Stewart, but because he was concerned about appearances. "People will judge us by how we honor him," he'd said, as if Stewart's funeral was a performance for the community rather than a goodbye to our son. But it was during the viewing yesterday that the emotional cost of keeping my discovery secret had become almost unbearable. Watching Randall parade Annabelle around as family while our son lay in his casket felt like a desecration of everything sacred. The whispers from our friends and neighbors, the shocked faces of Stewart's colleagues, the way even Pastor Williams had struggled to maintain his composure, it was all building toward a reckoning. I could no longer postpone. The final straw had come this morning during Randall's phone call with Annabelle. I'd heard him through the kitchen window, discussing their plans for after the memorial service. "We should probably wait a week or two before we go public," he'd said. "Out of respect. But then we can start looking at rings." Rings. He was discussing engagement rings while planning our son's funeral. That's when I'd made the final decision about timing. Originally, I'd planned to wait until after the service, to give Stewart's memory one last day of peace before the storm hit. But sitting in my kitchen, listening to my husband plan his proposal to his mistress, I realized that delaying would only give him more opportunities to humiliate our son's memory. I pulled out my phone and sent a text to Patricia Reeves. "Proceed with everything we discussed today." Her response came back immediately. "Are you certain? Once we begin, there's no going back." I looked around the kitchen where I'd raised my son, where I'd cooked thousands of meals for a man who was now counting the hours until he could replace me, where I'd spent 43 years building a life that had turned out to be an illusion. "I'm certain," I typed back. "It's time." Within minutes, Patricia had set everything in motion. The legal papers would be served this afternoon, immediately following the memorial service. The joint accounts would be frozen by close of business today. The letter to the Rotary Club president would be hand-delivered by 3 p.m., but those were just the opening moves. The real surprise, the one that would shatter Randall's assumptions about his comfortable future, was something I hadn't even told Patricia about yet, because while Randall had been busy planning his new life with Annabelle, I'd been planning something much more permanent for myself. Something that would ensure he understood exactly what he'd lost when he chose a 28-year-old dental hygienist over 43 years of marriage and partnership. Today wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about making sure that ending would cost him everything he actually valued: his reputation, his social standing, his financial security, and his comfortable assumptions about who held the power in our relationship. The memorial service would begin in 3 hours. By the time it ended, Randall Patterson's life as he knew it would be over. The first sign that this day would be different from what Randall expected came when we arrived at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where we'd been members for over 30 years. Instead of the quiet, respectful gathering he'd anticipated, the parking lot was unusually full. Cars I didn't recognize lined the street, and I could see people standing in small groups near the church entrance, their conversations animated. Despite the somber occasion. "Why are there so many people here?" Randall asked, adjusting his tie nervously as we sat in our car. "I thought we agreed to keep this small and private." I had agreed to no such thing, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I checked my phone and saw a text from Patricia, process server standing by. Everything else in motion. "Are you ready for this?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed back, "More ready than I've been for anything in 43 years. As we walked toward the church entrance, I noticed several people I hadn't expected to see. Margaret Hutchins, my financial advisor, stood near the steps with a man I didn't recognize but suspected was from the district attorney's office. Dorothy Chen was there with her husband, along with Marcus Webb, who nodded at me almost imperceptibly. Even Linda from the bank had come, though she looked nervous and kept glancing around as if she wasn't sure she should be there, but it was the presence of two particular individuals that made Randall stop walking entirely. Standing near the church doors were James Morrison, president of the Rotary Club, and Detective Sarah Collins from the White Collar Crime Division, a woman I'd met with twice in the past month to discuss potential fraud charges. "Greta," Randall said, his voice tight with confusion, "what's going on? Why are all these people here?" Before I could answer, Annabelle appeared at his side, materializing from somewhere behind us with the precision of someone who'd been watching for our arrival. She was dressed in a black dress that was somehow both appropriate for a funeral and completely inappropriate for her role in it, too tight, too short, too attention-seeking for someone who should have been invisible on this day. "Randall, sweetheart," she said, slipping her arm through his with practiced ease, "I've been waiting for you. There are some people here asking questions about our business. I think there might be some misunderstanding." The word "sweetheart," spoken aloud at my son's funeral, in front of half our community, was like a match struck in a room full of gasoline. I felt the last of my restraint evaporate, replaced by a cold clarity that surprised me with its intensity. "There's no misunderstanding," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Several conversations around us stopped as people turned to listen. "Would you like to know what's really going on, Randall?" Something in my tone must have warned him, because he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine fear. After 43 years of marriage, after months of taking my silence for granted, he was finally seeing me clearly. "Greta, this isn't the time or place for what?" I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. "For truth? For accountability? For consequences?" I looked around at the gathering crowd, recognizing faces of people who'd known us for decades. Who'd watched our marriage, who'd respected us as a couple. "Actually, I think this is exactly the time and place." I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. The weight of it felt different now. Not like a burden, but like a weapon. "You see, Randall, while you've been busy playing house with your girlfriend and embezzling from our marriage to fund your fantasy business, I've been busy too." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph, one of him and Annabelle. At the Asheville resort, toasting with champagne while Stewart was undergoing chemotherapy, Annabelle gasped, her face going pale as she recognized the image. Randall reached for the photograph, but I held it high enough for others to see. "This was taken 3 months ago," I announced to the growing crowd, while our son was fighting for his life. The resort charges on our joint credit card totaled $8,000, listed as medical equipment consultation. "Greta, stop this," Randall hissed, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking around at the faces surrounding us, neighbors, business associates, church members, and I could see him calculating the damage to his reputation with each passing second. "Oh, but we're just getting started," I continued, pulling out the next set of documents. "Would you like to see the business registration for Premium Practice Solutions? The company you started with your girlfriend here, using $75,000 from our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent." James Morrison stepped forward, his face grim. "Mrs. Patterson, I think we need to have a conversation about the information you shared with me yesterday." Detective Collins moved closer as well, her presence making Annabelle shift nervously from foot to foot. "Mr. Patterson, we've been reviewing some financial documents that raise questions about potential fraud. We'd like to speak with you after the service." The color drained from Randall's face as the full scope of what was happening began to dawn on him. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a coordinated revelation that I'd been planning for months. "You can't do this," he whispered. To me, desperation creeping into his voice. "Not here. Not at Stewart's funeral." I looked at him for a long moment, this man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, this man who'd chosen to desecrate our son's memory with his selfishness and betrayal. You did this, I said quietly. You chose to bring your mistress to our son's viewing. You chose to introduce her as family while he lay in his casket. You chose to plan your engagement while planning his funeral. I'm simply choosing to respond. Pastor Williams appeared at my elbow, his face troubled but kind. Mrs. Patterson, perhaps we should move this inside? Stewart's service should be about honoring his memory. You're absolutely right, Pastor, I agreed. And honoring his memory means making sure everyone understands exactly what kind of man his father turned out to be. I pulled out the final document. From my envelope, the separation agreement that Patricia had prepared, along with papers that would freeze all joint accounts and assets pending divorce proceedings. These are being served to you formally this afternoon, I told Randall, but I wanted you to understand what was happening before then. Our marriage is over. Your access to our joint finances is terminated as of today. And your business partner. Here. I looked at Annabelle, who was now visibly trembling. She's about to discover what happens when a failing business loses its secret funding source. The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the unfolding drama. I could see phones being discreetly raised, social media posts being typed, the story of Randall Patterson's spectacular downfall beginning to spread in real time. 43 years, I said, my voice carrying across the church parking lot. 43 years I spent building a life with a man who thought so little of me. That he believed I'd never fight back. Today, he learns how wrong he was. As if on cue, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Patricia Reeves stepped out, followed by a process server carrying official documents. The legal machinery I'd set in motion was now unstoppable, rolling forward with the inevitability of justice too long delayed. Randall looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the consequences of his choices. The breaking point had arrived, and everyone was watching. You're being served, Patricia announced with professional precision as the process server stepped forward with the legal documents. The words rang out across the church parking lot like a judge's gavel, final and irrevocable. Randall stared at the papers being thrust toward him as if they were written in a foreign language. I don't understand, he said weakly, but his hands were shaking as he accepted the documents. Greta, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers. We don't need to make this public. We needed to work it out 8 months ago, I replied calmly, before you started stealing from our marriage to fund your girlfriend's lifestyle. We needed to work it out before you introduced your mistress as family at our son's viewing. We needed to work it out before you discussed engagement rings on the morning of his funeral. The crowd around us had grown silent, hanging on every word. These were people who'd known us for decades, who'd attended dinner parties at our house, who'd celebrated holidays and anniversaries with us. They were witnessing the complete destruction of what they believed was one of the community's most stable marriages. Detective Collins stepped forward, her badge clearly visible. Mr. Patterson, we need to discuss some irregularities in your business filings. There appear to be discrepancies between what you've reported to the IRS and what you've actually been doing with investor funds. Investor funds? Annabelle spoke. For the first time, her voice high and frightened. Randall, what is she talking about? What investor funds? I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. Because what was about to be revealed would destroy her naive assumptions about the man she'd chosen to have an affair with. Marcus Webb stepped out of the crowd, holding a thick folder. Miss Brooks, are you aware that Mr. Patterson has been listing you as the beneficiary of several life insurance policies that name his business as the insured party? Policies that were purchased with funds from joint marital accounts. The color drained from Annabelle's face. Life insurance? Randall, you never mentioned anything about life insurance. Or the fact, Marcus continued, that your business partner here has been claiming tax deductions for business expenses that were actually personal expenditures for your relationship? The IRS considers that fraud. Randall was frantically flipping through the legal papers, his face growing paler with each page. This is impossible, he muttered. You can't freeze our accounts. That money is mine too. Actually, Patricia interjected, her voice crisp and professional. Under North Carolina law, when marital assets are used to fund adultery, the innocent spouse is entitled to significant protection. Mrs. Patterson has documented evidence of your affair and the misuse of joint funds. The court has already approved temporary measures to protect the remaining assets. Margaret Hutchins, my financial advisor, stepped forward with her own folder. Mr. Patterson, I'm required to inform you that as of this morning, your access to all joint accounts has been suspended pending the outcome of divorce proceedings. This includes your business accounts that were funded with marital assets. The implications hit Randall like a physical blow. Without access to our joint accounts, his failing business would collapse within days. The office lease, the employee salaries, the loan payments on all that expensive equipment, everything would come to a grinding halt. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. 43 years of marriage, and you're going to destroy me over a mistake? Over a moment of weakness? A moment of weakness? I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. 8 months of systematic deception is not a moment. Stealing $75,000 is not weakness. Bringing your girlfriend to our son's funeral is not a mistake. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of screenshots I'd been collecting for months. Would you like to see Annabelle's Instagram posts from your business trips? The ones where she documented every expensive dinner, every luxury hotel, every romantic weekend you charged to our joint credit cards. Annabelle grabbed for my phone. But I held it out of reach. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see the evidence of the affair that had been hiding in plain sight on social media. "Here's my personal favorite," I announced, swiping to a particular photo. "This is from your trip to Charleston 3 months ago." Annabelle posted this picture of champagne and strawberries in what she called the most romantic hotel suite ever. Our credit card statement shows a charge for $1,200 at the Charleston Harbor Resort for that weekend. The same weekend you told me you were at an insurance conference in Columbia. James Morrison from the Rotary Club was studying the documents Patricia had given him, his expression growing darker by the minute. "Mr. Patterson, it appears you've been using your Rotary Club membership to solicit clients for a business that's essentially a shell corporation. We take ethics violations very seriously." "This is a witch hunt," Randall protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking around desperately, perhaps hoping someone would defend him, but the faces surrounding him showed only shock and disgust. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should move this inside. People are arriving for Stewart's service, and I think we need to focus on honoring his memory." "You're absolutely right, Pastor," I agreed. "And the best way to honor Stewart's memory is to make sure everyone understands that his father's behavior is not a reflection of the man we raised." I turned to face the crowd directly, my voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "My husband thought I was too old, too trusting, too broken by grief to fight back. He thought he could steal from our marriage, flaunt his affair, and humiliate me publicly without consequences. He was wrong." Detective Collins was making notes in a small pad. "Mrs. Patterson, we'll need you to come to the station after the service to provide formal statements about the financial irregularities. Mr. Patterson, you'll need to come in as well to answer some questions." The final piece of evidence I pulled from my envelope was a document that even Patricia didn't know I had. "Randall, there's one more thing you should know. 3 months ago, when I discovered your affair, I hired a forensic accountant to review all of our joint holdings." I handed him the report I'd been saving for this moment. "It turns out that your business partner here hasn't been entirely honest with you either. Miss Brooks has been withdrawing cash from your business accounts, money you thought was going to legitimate business expenses. According to this report, she's taken nearly $30,000 for personal use over the past 4 months. Annabelle's face went white. "That's not true. Randall, you know I would never." "The bank surveillance footage says otherwise," Marcus Webb interrupted. "We have video of you making cash withdrawals from multiple ATMs using the business debit card. Withdrawals that don't appear on any expense reports." The betrayal within the betrayal was too much for Randall to process. He looked at Annabelle with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You said you loved me," he whispered. "I do love you," she protested, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You loved his money," I corrected calmly. "Just like he loved your youth. Neither of you loved anything real." The process server had finished his work, and Patricia was explaining to Randall what the various documents meant for his immediate future. No access to joint accounts. No contact with me except through lawyers. No removal of assets from the marital home. "The house," Randall said suddenly, as if just remembering. "The house is in both our names. You can't keep me from my own house." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "Actually, Randall, if you check the deed, which I'm sure your lawyer will do very soon, you'll discover that the house has been in my name alone for the past 15 years. Remember? Your accountant suggested the transfer for tax purposes. You signed the quitclaim deed yourself." The final realization hit him like a physical blow. Not only was his marriage over, not only was his business collapsing, not only was he facing potential criminal charges, he was also homeless. As Pastor Williams began gently encouraging people to move inside for the service, I took one last look at the man I'd been married to for 43 years. He stood in the church parking lot, holding legal papers that would destroy his comfortable life, next to a young woman who had been stealing from him even as she proclaimed her love. 43 years, I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "And you threw it all away for this?" Then I turned and walked into the church to bury my son with the dignity his father had tried to deny him. Inside the church, as I walked down the aisle toward the front pew where I would sit alone to mourn my son, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of conversations as people filed in, many of them still processing what they'd witnessed in the parking lot. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely, what the gathered mourners didn't. No, what even Patricia didn't fully understand, was the complete scope of what I'd uncovered during my months of investigation. The parking lot revelation had been just the tip of the iceberg. The real depth of Randall's deception ran so much deeper than anyone imagined. It had started 3 weeks after I hired Marcus Webb, when he'd come to my house with a manila folder, thick enough to use as a doorstop. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said, his expression grim, "I think you need to sit down for this." The first revelation had been about Premium Practice Solutions clients. The 3 consulting contracts that Randall and Annabelle claimed to have secured were not just minimal, they were fraudulent. Marcus had contacted each of the supposed clients, only to discover that 2 of them had never heard of Premium Practice Solutions, and the third had actually fired them after one disastrous consultation session. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the owner of a small dental practice in Charlotte, had agreed to speak with Marcus about her experience. "They promised to increase our efficiency by 30%, she'd explained. Instead, they suggested we replace all our equipment with models that cost 3 times as much but offered no real improvements." When I questioned their recommendations, the young woman, Annabelle, I think, became defensive and suggested I didn't understand modern business practices. I ended their contract the same day. But it got worse. The other 2 clients, on their website testimonials, were complete fabrications. Marcus had traced the addresses to vacant lots and the phone numbers to disconnected lines. Randall and Annabelle had created an entirely fictional client base to justify their business expenses and make themselves appear successful to potential investors, because there had been investors. Real ones, through church connections and Rotary Club meetings. Randall had convinced 6 local business owners to invest in Premium Practice Solutions. He presented them with fake client testimonials, fabricated revenue projections, and promises of returns that were mathematically impossible given their actual business model. Mr. Franklin Chen, no relation to my friend Dorothy, had invested $15,000 based on Randall's claim that they were revolutionizing the dental industry. Mrs. Janet Walsh, a widow from our church, had invested her late husband's life insurance payout of $25,000 after Randall assured her it was the safest investment she could make. In total, Randall had collected over $80,000 from local investors, money that had gone directly into the business account that funded his affair with Annabelle. None of the investors had seen a penny of return, and most were unaware that their money had been spent on luxury office furniture, romantic dinners, and weekend getaways. The securities fraud charges that Detective Collins was preparing would likely result in federal prosecution. Investment fraud carries serious penalties, especially when it targets elderly victims and uses religious or community connections to build trust, but the discovery that had truly shocked me was hidden in the insurance policies Marcus had mentioned. In the parking lot. Randall hadn't just purchased life insurance policies on the business, he'd purchased a policy on me. 6 months ago, while I was focused on Stewart's declining health. Randall had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy naming himself as the beneficiary. The application listed me as having various health conditions I didn't actually have, including heart disease and diabetes. The premiums were being paid from our joint account, disguised as medical insurance expenses. When Marcus showed me the policy documents, my blood had run cold. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said carefully, "I've seen this pattern before in my police work. Usually, it doesn't end well for the spouse." The implications were terrifying. A man facing financial ruin, criminal charges, and the loss of his comfortable lifestyle might become desperate enough to consider permanent solutions. The fact that he'd lied on the insurance application suggested he'd been planning something more sinister than just divorce. That's when I'd made the decision to accelerate my timeline. Originally, I'd planned to gather evidence for 6 more months before confronting Randall. But the insurance policy changed everything. I couldn't risk waiting any longer. I'd immediately contacted Patricia about expediting the divorce proceedings and arranging for additional security. I'd also shared the insurance policy information with Detective Collins, who'd assured me that it would be part of their investigation, but there was another layer to Randall's deception that even Marcus hadn't uncovered initially. It was something I'd discovered myself, quite by accident, while going through old photo albums to prepare Stewart's memorial display. Hidden in a box in our attic, I'd found documents showing that this wasn't Randall's first affair. There had been others over the years, carefully concealed relationships that I'd been too trusting to notice. Bank statements from 15 years ago showed similar patterns of unexplained expenses, mysterious trips, and cash withdrawals. The woman's name was Linda Morrison, James Morrison's ex-wife. The irony wasn't lost on me that the current Rotary Club president would be instrumental in exposing an affair that mirrored his own marital destruction. Linda had divorced James 15 years ago, citing adultery and financial deception. According to the documents I'd found, Randall had been the other man. There had been others too. Sarah Phillips, who'd worked at our insurance agency briefly in 2010. Margaret Turner, a client whose husband had died in a car accident, leaving her vulnerable and grieving. Randall had a pattern of targeting women who were emotionally vulnerable or financially dependent, offering them attention and promises while stealing from our marriage to fund these relationships. Annabelle wasn't his midlife crisis. She was simply his latest victim in a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior that I'd been too naive to recognize. The most painful discovery had been a diary entry I'd found in Stewart's belongings after he died. He'd written it during his final weeks, when he was trying to make sense of his father's absence during his illness. "Dad's been different for as long as I can remember," Stewart had written in his careful engineer's handwriting. "I used to think he was just busy with work, but now I realize he's been checking out of our family for years. Mom deserves so much better than the way he treats her. I hope she finds the strength to leave him after I'm gone. She's the strongest person I know, even if she doesn't see it herself." Reading those words had broken my heart and strengthened my resolve simultaneously. My son had seen what I'd been blind to, and he'd trusted me to find the courage to act on it. Now, sitting in the front pew of the church where Stewart would be remembered and celebrated, I thought about the conversation I'd had with him just a week before he died. He'd been worried about leaving me alone with Randall, sensing something was wrong even in his weakened state. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself, Mom," he'd whispered. "Don't let anyone treat you like you don't matter. You matter more than anyone." Looking at his photograph on the easel beside his casket, I made that promise again silently. I'd taken care of myself, just as he'd asked. And in doing so, I'd ensured that his memory wouldn't be overshadowed by his father's betrayals. Outside, I could hear Randall's voice rising in anger as he argued with Detective Collins and Patricia. But inside the sanctuary, surrounded by people who genuinely loved Stewart, I felt only peace. The depth of my husband's deception had been staggering, but my response had been equally comprehensive. Every lie he'd told had been documented. Every theft had been traced. Every betrayal had been exposed. The memorial service was about to begin, and for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. As Pastor Williams began the memorial service with a prayer for Stewart's soul, I could hear the commotion continuing outside. Through the stained glass windows, muffled voices carried the sound of Randall's world collapsing in real time. But inside the sanctuary, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my son, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The service proceeded beautifully. Franklin spoke about Stewart's integrity and kindness. My sister Janice shared memories of family holidays when Stewart would patiently explain engineering concepts to his young cousins. Colleagues from his firm described his dedication to mentoring new engineers and his innovative problem-solving approach, but it was Pastor Williams' eulogy that captured the essence of who Stewart had been. Stewart Patterson was a man who believed in building things that would last, bridges that would stand for generations, relationships built on trust and honesty, a legacy of service to others. As those words echoed through the church, I thought about the contrast between the man we were honoring and the man who should have been sitting beside me, grieving his son instead of panicking about his crumbling deceptions. About halfway through the service, the church doors opened quietly, and Detective Collins slipped inside. She took a seat in the back pew, her presence a reminder that this day was about more than just saying goodbye to Stewart. It was about justice finally being served. When Pastor Williams invited me to speak, I rose slowly and walked to the podium. Looking out at the congregation, I saw faces filled with sympathy and respect. These were people who'd watched Stewart grow up, who'd celebrated his achievements, who'd mourned with us during his illness. "My son Stewart believed in truth," I began, my voice clear and strong. "He believed that foundations matter, whether you're building a bridge or building a life. He believed that integrity isn't just something you practice when it's convenient, it's something you live by, especially when it's difficult." I paused, glancing toward the closed church doors. Stewart also believed that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is tear down something that's built on lies, so that something honest can be built in its place. A murmur of understanding rippled through the congregation. They knew I wasn't just talking about engineering principles. 3 weeks before Stewart died, he made me promise to take care of myself. He said I was stronger than I knew, and that I mattered more than anyone. Today, I kept that promise. The service concluded with Stewart's favorite hymn, "How Great Thou Art," sung by a congregation that included his childhood friends, his professional colleagues, and the community members who'd known him his entire life. As the final notes faded, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Margaret Hutchins, my financial advisor. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered, "there's something you should know. Mr. Patterson tried to access the accounts again about 20 minutes ago. When he was denied, he became quite agitated." Through the window, I could see Randall pacing frantically in the parking lot, his phone pressed to his ear. Annabelle stood apart from him now, looking lost and frightened. Several of the investors he'd defrauded had arrived and were speaking with Detective Collins, their faces grim with the realization of what had been done to them. As people began filing out of the church to head to the cemetery for the burial, Patricia appeared at my side. "Greta, there's been a development. Randall's attorney is trying to get an emergency injunction to unfreeze the accounts. He's claiming that you've acted maliciously to deprive him of his livelihood." I almost laughed at the irony. His livelihood was built on fraud and theft. "I know that, and the court will too. But there's something else. Annabelle Brooks has requested to speak with you. She's asking for help." Looking out at the young woman who'd helped destroy my marriage, I felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. She was about to discover what I'd learned over 43 years. Randall Patterson was very good at making women feel special until he decided they were no longer useful to him. "Tell her I'll speak with her after the burial," I said. "But make it clear that any conversation we have will be with Detective Collins present." As the pallbearers, Stewart's engineering colleagues and childhood friends, carried his casket out of the church, I followed behind them, holding my head high. The confrontation that had begun in the parking lot was far from over, but the most important part was behind me. I had honored my son's memory with truth and dignity. Everything else was just the cleanup. The cemetery, as Stewart's casket was lowered into the ground beside the headstone we'd chosen together, I felt the weight of 43 years of marriage finally lifting from my shoulders. The graveside service was small and intimate, just family and close friends who'd truly known my son. Randall stood apart from the group, flanked by Detective Collins and his hastily hired attorney, a nervous young man who kept whispering urgently in his ear. When Pastor Williams invited anyone who wished to share a final memory, I stepped forward. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and I could feel the autumn chill in the air. Stewart's favorite season, when he'd love to walk through the changing leaves and plan his next engineering project. "Stewart once told me that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never face storms," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "They're the ones that bend without breaking, that weather the worst conditions and emerge still standing." I looked directly at Randall as I continued. "He taught me that sometimes you have to tear down what's rotten to build something that will last." As the service concluded and people began to disperse, Annabelle approached me tentatively. Up close, without the confident mask she'd worn at the funeral home, she looked very young and very frightened. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and her hands shook as she clutched a wadded tissue. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Could I speak with you? Please?" Detective Collins stepped closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but I nodded. "Of course, dear. But Detective Collins will need to be present." We walked to a quiet corner of the cemetery, away from the departing mourners. Annabelle seemed to struggle with where to begin, her eyes darting between me and the detective. "I didn't know," she finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "About the investors, about the fake clients, about any of it. He told me we were building something real together, that we were going to revolutionize dental consulting. I believed him because..." She trailed off, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Because he's very good at making women feel special," I finished gently. "Until he's not." She nodded miserably. "The money I took from the business account, I didn't think it was stealing. He told me it was my salary, that I'd earned it. He said the cash was easier for tax purposes." She looked up at me with desperate eyes. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I never meant to hurt you." Detective Collins was taking notes, but her expression wasn't unsympathetic. "Miss Brooks, we've reviewed your financial records. It appears you've been living paycheck to paycheck for most of your adult life. The amounts you withdrew, while significant, suggest someone who was told this was legitimate compensation rather than someone running a sophisticated fraud." I studied Annabelle's face, really looked at her for the first time without the filter of anger and betrayal. She was just 28, the same age I'd been when I married Randall. Young enough to be dazzled by an older man's attention, naive enough to believe his promises, vulnerable enough to ignore red flags in favor of feeling chosen. "How long has he been promising to leave me?" I asked quietly. "Since the beginning," she admitted. "He said you two had grown apart, that you were just staying together out of habit. He said you'd be happier without him." She let out a bitter laugh. "He made it sound like he was doing you a favor. The same lies he'd probably told all the others." I thought about Linda Morrison, Sarah Phillips, Margaret Turner, all the women who'd believed they were special, that they were different, that Randall Patterson was finally ready to choose love over comfort. Annabelle, I said carefully. I need you to understand something. You weren't his first affair, and you wouldn't have been his last. This is what he does. He finds women who are vulnerable or lonely, he makes them feel chosen, and then he uses them until something better comes along. Her face crumpled. But he said he loved me. He said we were going to get married after I was out of the picture, I finished. Yes, I'm sure he did. Tell me, did he ever give you anything that couldn't be taken back? Jewelry that was actually yours, not just borrowed? A lease with your name on it? Legal documentation of your business partnership? The answer was written all over her face. Everything Randall had given her, the office, the business cards, the promises, could be revoked the moment he decided she was no longer useful. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Collins interjected, Miss Brooks has agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation. Her testimony about the business operations and the investor meetings could be crucial to building the fraud case. I looked at this young woman who had unknowingly helped destroy my marriage but was now facing her own reckoning with Randall's deceptions. Annabelle, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm angry, yes, and hurt. But you were as much his victim as I was. The difference is that I had 43 years to learn who he really was. You only had 8 months. She was sobbing now, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. What am I going to do? I quit my job at the dental clinic. I don't have anywhere to live. Everything I thought was real was built on lies, I said softly. But that doesn't mean you can't build something real for yourself. It just means you'll have to do it honestly, without shortcuts or promises from men who see you as disposable. As we walked back toward the cars, I saw Randall watching us from across the cemetery. Even from a distance, I could see the panic in his posture. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For the first time in our entire marriage, Randall Patterson was completely powerless, and I was completely free. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my house, as the final divorce decree had confirmed, preparing coffee for two. Through the window, I could see the garden I'd been neglecting for years finally beginning to bloom again. The roses Randall had complained were too much work were thriving under my care, and I'd planted a memorial garden for Stewart near the back fence, where the morning sun would warm the bench I'd placed beneath his favorite oak tree. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock, and I opened it to find Detective Collins, now wearing civilian clothes and a warm smile. The investigation had concluded 3 weeks ago with Randall's guilty plea to multiple federal charges: investment fraud, mail fraud, and insurance fraud. He'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with restitution orders that would follow him for the rest of his life. Greta, she said, accepting the coffee I offered, I wanted to give you this personally. She handed me a check from the district attorney's office. It's your portion of the recovered assets from the Premium Practice Solutions case. The amount was substantial, nearly $40,000 that had been frozen in the business accounts. Combined with the settlement from my divorce and Stewart's inheritance, I was more financially secure than I'd been in years. But more importantly, I was emotionally secure for the first time in decades. How is Annabelle doing? I asked as we settled into my living room. Detective Collins had kept me updated on the young woman's situation throughout the legal proceedings. Better than we expected, actually. She's back at the dental clinic where she used to work. They hired her back after everything came out. And she's been attending counseling to help her recognize the warning signs of manipulative relationships. Detective Collins paused. She asked me to give you this. The envelope contained a handwritten letter on simple stationery. Annabelle's careful script filled 2 pages with an apology that felt genuine and thoughtful. She'd taken responsibility for her choices while acknowledging how Randall had exploited her vulnerabilities. Most surprisingly, she'd enclosed a small check, $50, with a note saying it was the beginning of paying back what I cost you in legal fees. It wasn't about the money, of course. It was about a young woman learning to take responsibility and make amends. I made a mental note to return the check with a letter encouraging her to put it toward her counseling sessions instead. The other investors are getting their money back too, Detective Collins continued. Mrs. Walsh, the widow from your church, was particularly grateful. She said to tell you that your courage gave her the strength to come forward. That meant more to me than any financial recovery. Janet Walsh had been devastated when she learned how Randall had exploited her trust, but she testified with dignity during the sentencing hearing. Seeing her reclaim her voice and her strength had been one of the most rewarding parts of this entire ordeal. My phone buzzed with a text from my granddaughter Susie, Stewart's daughter, who is now a junior in college. Grandma, can't wait to see you next weekend. I have so much to tell you about my internship at the engineering firm. Love you. Susie had been remarkable throughout this entire ordeal. Initially devastated by her father's death and shocked by the revelations about her grandfather, she'd gradually come to understand and support my decisions. Dad always said, "You were the strongest person he knew," she'd told me during one of our long phone conversations. Now I see what he meant. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the grief that would always live in its corners. I'd converted Randall's old office into a reading room, filling it with the books I'd always wanted to read but never had time for. The historical fiction novels I'd dreamed of writing in my youth had been replaced by a new dream, a memoir about finding strength at 71, about the importance of financial independence for women, about recognizing and escaping manipulative relationships. I'd been contacted by a literary agent who'd heard about my story through the local news coverage. "Women need to hear this," she'd said during our initial phone call. "Especially older women who think it's too late to start over." It wasn't too late. If anything, my age had been an advantage. I'd had 7 decades to develop the skills and wisdom necessary to outmaneuver a man who'd grown complacent in his assumptions about my capabilities. Detective Collins finished her coffee and prepared to leave. "You know, Greta, in all my years investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen someone handle a situation with as much strategic thinking as you did. You could have a second career as a private investigator." I laughed, but the idea wasn't entirely unappealing. There were probably other women out there, trapped in situations similar to mine, who could benefit from someone who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of exposing a long-term deception. As I walked Detective Collins to the door, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was 71 years old, a widow, a recent divorcee, and a first-time author-to-be. She was also free, financially independent, and surrounded by people who valued her for who she truly was. Randall had been wrong about so many things, but perhaps his greatest miscalculation was believing that time had made me weaker. Instead, it had made me unstoppable. 1 year to the day after Stewart's funeral, I stood at his graveside holding a single red rose and a copy of my published memoir, Never Too Late, A Widow's Guide to Starting Over at 71. The book had become a bestseller, resonating with women across the country who'd felt trapped by age, circumstance, or manipulative relationships. The morning was crisp and clear, exactly like the day we'd buried my son. But everything else had changed. "Stewart," I said quietly, placing the rose on his headstone, "you were right. I was stronger than I knew. And you were right about something else too. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tear down what's broken so something honest can grow in its place." My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, now not just my lawyer but my business partner in a consulting firm that helped women navigate complex divorces involving financial deception. We'd helped 43 women in the past year, 1-4. Each year of my marriage to Randall. The irony wasn't lost on me. Another text came from Detective Collins, now retired and working as a private investigator specializing in elder fraud cases. Randall's parole hearing was denied again. He'll serve the full 8 years. I felt no satisfaction in his continued imprisonment, only relief that other potential victims were safe from his manipulations for a while longer. As I walked back to my car, I passed the memorial bench I'd donated to the cemetery in Stewart's name. The plaque read, "In memory of Stewart Patterson, engineer, son, father. He believed that the strongest foundations are built on truth." That evening, I hosted dinner for my chosen family: Patricia, Detective Collins, Dorothy Chen, and most importantly, my granddaughter Susie, now graduated and working at the same engineering firm where her father had built his reputation on integrity. "Grandma," Susie said as we raised our glasses in a toast, "Dad would be so proud of what you've built from all this pain." She was right. From the ashes of a 43-year lie, I'd built something real, a business that protected other women. A book that gave them hope, and a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Randall had underestimated me for the last time. But more importantly, I had learned never to underestimate myself again. At 72, I wasn't ending my story. I was just beginning to write it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.